You're nothing but dead weight to this company. Jake, we've been carrying you for years, my boss sneered as the holiday party fell silent. The words hitting harder than any punch ever could, and in that thick velvet silence, filled with the clink of abandoned glasses and the faint hum of Sinatra playing over the hotel ballroom speakers, I felt the heat of dozens of eyes land on me, colleagues I had led through late-night deadlines, people I had vouched for in boardrooms, now staring like they were watching a man stripped naked in the middle of the room, waiting for what came next. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. My name is Jake Carter. I'm 38 years old, and I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, a place where hard work wasn't some buzzword for motivational posters. It was what your father's hands looked like at the dinner table after a 12-hour shift, where your word was supposed to be worth more than paper, more than signatures or seals, and yet here I stood, a successful man by most definitions, a vice president in a Fortune 500 tech firm headquartered in downtown Chicago, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit with my tie loosened, humiliated like a rookie in front of an entire company who had once cheered my name. I caught sight of the company coffee mug in my boss's hand, the same one I had designed years ago with our tagline etched in bold blue font, Building Trust, Building Tomorrow, a mug I'd once proudly given out to new hires as a welcome gift, and the bitter irony of it nearly choked me because that mug, more than anything else, felt like the knife they were twisting into my back. I didn't speak right away, though God knows a dozen comebacks screamed inside my skull, because I knew if I opened my mouth then, I would sound broken. And there was one thing I had that no one in that room knew about, one thing I had prepared long before this night ever came, a quiet weapon hidden beneath the surface that would change everything when the time was right. It's strange how betrayal doesn't come as a thunderclap, but as a slow drip, 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 and you never notice the leak until the floor is flooded. And for me, it began months before this night, when little things didn't add up, when financial reports had small discrepancies brushed off with smooth explanations, when projects I led were credited to others in oversight, when closed-door meetings happened without me, though they were about my divisions, and still, I shrugged it off, thinking maybe I was paranoid, maybe this was just corporate politics as usual. But when the man you once called your mentor, a man who shook your hand and told you the company wouldn't exist without you, turns on you with venom in his eyes, you realize the knife has been there for a long time. You were just too loyal, too trusting to feel the blade. His name was Richard Halle, senior executive, silver-haired, charming to investors but cold as marble underneath. And beside him stood two of my closest colleagues, people I had once toasted whiskey with at a dingy diner off the I-90 after long work weeks, people who swore they had my back, and the sight of their half-smiles as I was dressed down told me this wasn't some slip of the tongue. This was orchestrated, a performance, and I was the sacrifice. Richard raised his glass and said words about moving in a new direction while nodding toward a project I had built from the ground up. A project that was suddenly being credited to someone else, and the applause that followed felt like nails on a chalkboard, polite, hesitant, but damning nonetheless, as if the room had already decided I was done. I thought of my father in Dayton, a machinist who never made it past high school, but who taught me one lesson that never left me. Son, they can take the shirt off your back, but they can't take your word unless you give it away. And as I stood there swallowing humiliation, as I forced a tight smile while the vultures circled, I knew I had given away my word to people who never deserved it, and that was my real mistake. Richard smirked, thinking he had buried me, but he didn't know about the encrypted files sitting on a secure drive, records I had been keeping quietly ever since those first small discrepancies appeared. Files that contained more than just numbers. They told a story of fraud, of backroom deals, of embezzlement carefully hidden under my name. And while I stood humiliated, I held on to that knowledge like a man clutching a hidden blade under the table. My downfall had been plotted carefully, but my revenge was already breathing, quiet and patient, and as the laughter and whispers filled the ballroom, I promised myself one thing. I wouldn't just get even. I would make sure every single one of them drowned in the lies they had built. The weeks after that holiday party were like moving through molasses, every day slower, heavier, each step feeling like it sunk deeper into quicksand, because once they humiliated me publicly, Richard and his inner circle wasted no time tightening the screws in private, stripping me of projects I had built with my own hands, quietly reassigning my team members under the guise of corporate restructuring, freezing me out of key meetings with the excuse that I should focus on transition. A word that burned like acid because it meant they had already decided my exit. They just hadn't put it in writing yet, and what stung worse was the way people I thought of as allies suddenly avoided me in the elevator, eyes glued to their phones as if even accidental eye contact might tether them to a sinking ship. I'd walk into the downtown office, 30 stories up with glass walls looking over the Chicago River, and the place that once felt like the beating heart of everything I'd built now felt like an execution chamber. The stale coffee in the break room stinking of avoidance, laughter muttered in hallways cutting off the second I passed, as if everyone knew my obituary had already been drafted. And maybe they were right. Maybe in their world I was finished. But at night, when the lights of the loop flickered across my apartment windows and the city buzzed below like a restless machine, I would open the secure drive and review the files, reminding myself that I wasn't powerless. Not yet, because I still had the truth locked away, and truth, when delivered at the right moment, is more destructive than any weapon they could wield. There were days I almost believed their story, days I looked in the mirror and saw a fraud staring back because they were good at it. They planted whispers that I had botched contracts, that I was reckless with budgets, that my so-called innovations were really stolen from junior staff who deserved the credit, and after a while, when everyone repeats a lie with enough confidence, it starts to feel real even to the man being accused. I drank more than I should have, skipped meals, walked the riverfront late at night, asking myself if maybe this was my punishment for being too ambitious, for daring to think I could climb from a machinist's son in Dayton to a corporate executive in one of the biggest cities in America without eventually paying the price. And then, just when I thought the walls were closing in, a small wind broke through. One of my former analysts, a quiet kid named Ethan who'd been reassigned without explanation, reached out to me in secret, his voice trembling as he told me he didn't believe the rumors that he had seen data discrepancies too, but had been told to keep quiet or risk his job. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope, like maybe I wasn't crazy. Maybe someone else saw the shadows where I did. I met him at a greasy diner off the Kennedy Expressway, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and bottomless coffee, and as we talked over cold fries, he slid me a folder he had copied before being shut out of the system. More evidence that the financial fraud wasn't just real, it was far deeper than I had imagined, implicating not just Richard, but 2 other executives who had been playing the long game to cover their tracks. But as quickly as that hope sparked, it was nearly snuffed out, because the very next morning HR summoned me into a sterile office with beige walls and a box of tissues sitting ominously on the desk, and a woman with rehearsed sympathy in her eyes told me they were parting ways amicably. Though the thick severance agreement slid across the table looked more like a gag order than a farewell gift, and when I refused to sign, the smile dropped from her face like a mask and she leaned in close enough that I could smell the peppermint gum on her breath as she warned me that fighting would only make things worse. Worse like what? I thought worse than being stripped of everything I built, worse than watching my name dragged through dirt, worse than having my reputation destroyed so thoroughly that even my LinkedIn inbox was empty of offers because no one wanted to touch a man branded as toxic. Still, I walked out of that office without signing, clutching the unsigned papers like a badge of defiance, because I knew if I caved, if I sold my silence for a check, then the files on my drive would mean nothing, and all I would ever be remembered for was the story they wrote about me, not the truth I held in my hands. That night, as snow blanketed the city streets and I drove aimlessly down Lakeshore Drive, I realized something that both terrified and electrified me. Richard and his allies thought they had won, thought they had crushed me into dust, and that arrogance was their blind spot, because men who believe they're untouchable never see the knife until it's already in their back. My small win with Ethan was proof that cracks were forming in their empire, but the setback with HR reminded me that they had power, they had reach, and if I wanted to fight back, I would need more than righteous anger. I would need patience, precision, and timing, like setting a trap you know your prey can't resist. And so, as I stared at the skyline lit up against the black winter sky, I promised myself that I wouldn't rush it. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of watching me stumble in desperation. No, I would play the long game, the way they had played me, only this time, when the curtain dropped, it wouldn't be me standing exposed in humiliation. It would be them, naked in their greed, their corruption, their betrayal, destroyed by the very system they thought they controlled. If part 2 was about me drowning, part 3 was about me learning how to breathe underwater, because while Richard and his circle paraded around like victors, while they gave speeches about innovation and responsibility, with my stolen projects glowing on PowerPoint slides. I kept my head down and pretended to fade, moving through the world like a man already defeated, a shadow at networking events, a ghost in downtown coffee shops. But beneath that stillness, my trap was taking shape, every piece sliding into place with a quiet inevitability that they couldn't sense because arrogance had blinded them. Ethan became my lifeline, slipping me data through encrypted channels, spreadsheets riddled with subtle inconsistencies that, when stitched together with the records I had been keeping for months, painted a picture not just of fraud but of deliberate embezzlement laundered through shell subsidiaries, a scheme so audacious that once exposed it would implode the company's credibility with shareholders overnight. I knew timing mattered. If I struck too soon, they'd bury me legally. If I struck too late, the evidence trail might evaporate, so I set my eyes on the ticking clock. No one else seemed to hear. The upcoming board audit, scheduled 3 months out. A routine check usually rubber-stamped, but this year carrying the weight of investor scrutiny because of whispers in the market about instability. 3 months. That was my deadline, my window, my blade. Still, playing the broken man wasn't easy, and there were days it cut deeper than the betrayal itself, because people I once called friends now spoke about me in the past tense, as if I had already been erased. And when I sat in my apartment staring at the skyline, there were nights I almost believed it, almost signed the severance papers just to make the weight stop crushing my chest. But then I'd glance at that old company coffee mug sitting on my desk, the one with the slogan etched into it, "Building trust, building tomorrow," and it would make my blood boil so hot it burned the doubt away, because I realized that phrase was more than just empty branding. It was irony begging to become justice, and in my mind I saw the poetic symmetry of it. The same object Richard had raised while humiliating me at the holiday party would one day become the object he choked on when the truth came out. To fuel myself, I went back to Dayton for a weekend, sat with my father at the old diner with grease-stained menus, listened to his gruff voice remind me that men who steal always think they're clever, but cleverness never outruns the truth. And when I returned to Chicago, I felt steadier, like the boy he raised was still alive inside the man who had been gutted in that ballroom. As weeks ticked by, Richard and his allies tightened their grip on the company, boasting about new partnerships and revenue spikes that were nothing more than doctored numbers, even planting articles in business journals to solidify their illusion of control. And each headline was a dagger. But I kept my rage hidden, because the deeper they buried themselves in their lies, the harder the fall would be. I tested my plan in small ways, seeding whispers of my own to mid-level managers, feeding innocuous questions through contacts in accounting, watching as panic flickered behind Richard's eyes when he thought no one noticed, and I knew then that the cracks were spreading faster than he could plaster over them. The turning point came one gray morning when Ethan messaged me with a single line: "They're falsifying board packets." I felt my pulse slam in my throat because it confirmed what I had suspected. They weren't just cooking internal books. They were preparing to deceive the very board that held the power to oust them, and that arrogance, that willingness to gamble the entire company's future for their scheme, was the opening I needed. So I began laying the trap, quiet and methodical, compiling the evidence into a dossier so airtight it could survive any legal crossfire, formatting it with the precision of a man who knew the difference between accusation and proof, and instead of running to the board myself, I slipped it anonymously through a trusted contact on the audit committee, someone whose career depended on ferreting out exactly this kind of corruption. That was the beauty of it. Richard believed I was powerless, unemployed, broken, but in reality I had weaponized the very structure of accountability he thought was his shield. And just to twist the blade, I left subtle clues of my hand in the shadows, an anonymous tip here, a probing question there, so that when the truth detonated, he would have just enough time to realize who had been moving pieces behind the curtain. Of course, in any story like this, the villains always get one last victory before their fall, and mine came 2 weeks before the audit when I was hit with a lawsuit, personal and vicious, accusing me of breaching confidentiality and stealing company property, a move designed to drain me financially and smear my name further in the press. And for a moment I thought the walls were closing in again, until I realized that this was actually the final piece of rope they were tightening around their own necks, because by filing that suit, they ensured my defense would drag all the documents into discovery, meaning every incriminating spreadsheet, every falsified transaction, every shell company payment they had buried under my name would be forced into daylight. I almost laughed when I realized it, a sharp, bitter laugh in the middle of my tiny apartment, because Richard had no idea the trap was already locked, the spring already coiled, and his final act of aggression had only guaranteed his ruin. And so, with the audit looming like a storm on the horizon and the lawsuit quietly turning against its authors, I prepared myself for the climax, the moment when everything would snap into place, when Richard would stand where I once stood public, exposed, humiliated, and the only question left in my mind was not whether justice would come but how poetic it would feel when that coffee mug, that hollow symbol of trust, returned to shatter in his hands the way he had tried to shatter me. The day of the audit arrived with the kind of crisp cold that bites into your skin and wakes something primal inside you, and as I stood across the street from our gleaming Chicago headquarters, the glass tower catching the winter sun like a blade, I felt the strangest calm, as if all the storms of the past months had funneled into this single point of clarity, and for the first time since that holiday party humiliation, I wasn't the hunted, I was the trap waiting to snap shut. I didn't attend the audit in person, of course. Richard and his circle had made sure I was persona non grata, my access badge disabled, my name scrubbed from directories, but that didn't matter, because I was there in every spreadsheet, every email, every falsified record, tucked neatly into the dossier I had slipped to the audit committee, and I knew the moment they began asking questions, Richard's polished mask would start to crack. Around noon, Ethan texted me from inside. "They're stalling. Richard's sweating." I pictured it, the confident executive suddenly fumbling, his silver hair plastered to his forehead, his voice a little too sharp as he tried to explain discrepancies that no longer looked like innocent mistakes, but like deliberate theft, and I savored the thought like a slow sip of bourbon. By 2 o'clock, the text came that made my heart hammer. Board calling emergency session. That was it. The noose was tightening, and he didn't even realize the knot was one he had tied himself. But fate, I've learned, always saves its cruelest irony for last, because just when I thought I had scripted the perfect downfall, the double twist revealed itself. The first twist came swiftly. The board announced not only that Richard and the 2 other executives were suspended pending investigation, but that the SEC had already been tipped off, meaning this wasn't just an internal scandal anymore. This was federal, and the penalties weren't limited to reputational ruin. They were staring down prison sentences. I hadn't tipped off the SEC, which meant someone else had, and in the pit of my stomach I realized Ethan had taken the evidence I gave him and gone a step further, bypassing even me, and though part of me felt betrayed again, another part felt a strange pride, because it meant I hadn't just built a trap, I had inspired someone else to act, and together we had created a tidal wave too big for Richard to escape. The second twist came minutes later when I was served papers, not of accusation this time, but of reinstatement, because the board, desperate to salvage credibility, decided to publicly announce that I had been the whistleblower who exposed corruption, painting me as a hero who had sacrificed his career to protect the company. And suddenly the same press that had once dragged my name through mud was calling for interviews, plastering my photo next to headlines about integrity in leadership. It was whiplash dizzying to go from villain to savior in the span of a day, and as I sat in my apartment staring at the flood of messages lighting up my phone, I laughed so hard it shook me, because I realized Richard's attempt to bury me had not only failed, it had catapulted me into a higher standing than I could have dreamed. And yet the most poetic justice came not from headlines or reinstatement, or even the looming prison sentences for my betrayers, but from something small, symbolic, something that tied the story back to the moment it all began. A week after the audit detonated, I was asked to attend a press conference at headquarters, and though I hesitated because stepping back into that building felt like walking into the mouth of the beast, I agreed. As I entered the familiar glass lobby, cameras flashing, microphones shoved toward me, I noticed a display table set up with branded company merchandise for employees and guests, and there it was, the same coffee mug, building trust, building tomorrow, sitting innocent among the pens and tote bags. Without thinking, I picked one up, turned it in my hand, the ceramic cold and solid, and when a reporter asked me how it felt to return, I held up the mug and said, "This company forgot what trust meant. That's why it nearly destroyed itself, but tomorrow starts here." The crowd erupted in applause, flashes popping like fireworks, and I saw in that moment the full circle of it. The same object Richard had used to mock me at my lowest had become the symbol of my victory, the proof that trust, once betrayed, can still be reclaimed and weaponized. Later, as I walked out onto the cold Chicago streets, free in a way I had never been before, I thought of my father in Dayton, his calloused hands gripping my shoulder as he once told me, "They can take everything, son, but they can't take your word." He had been right all along. My word, my records, my truth had been the quiet weapon that turned the tide, and though I had been broken, humiliated, stripped down to nothing, I hadn't given away the one thing that mattered. Richard and his allies had destroyed themselves with their greed, choking on the lies they thought would sustain them, while I walked away not just vindicated but transformed, no longer the loyal soldier who trusted too easily, but a man who understood that revenge, when served with patience and precision, doesn't just punish your enemies, it frees you from them. And as I sipped coffee from that mug in the days that followed, watching the city buzz with new opportunities, I felt something I hadn't in months. Peace, sharp and quiet, the kind that comes when justice finally lands exactly where it belongs. If you enjoyed this story, please give a thumbs up to the video and consider subscribing to the channel for more powerful true life stories.